Well, first of all, you have shown Ableton where your plugins are, but how did they get there? So what's happening? Plugins are just additional pieces of software that we can use with our digital audio workstation. Now, particularly VST plugins, and the acronym stands for Virtual Studio Technology, is a standard developed by Steinberg, which means that any digital audio workstation that supports this standard can load these plugins, these additional pieces of software that we can use within our digital audio workstation. Now, usually when we install a plugin, we can choose a location where that plugin is going to be placed. And obviously that location for me is going to be this folder. Once I start my Ableton, it will scan through that folder and find all of the plugins that are there, scan them, and of course test them to see if Ableton can actually support using those. And after that's done, I would see all of those scanned plugins in my plugin folder right here. Now, what are plugins? Plugins, as I said, are additional pieces of software that we can use in our digital audio workstations, and they can be audio processors or audio generators. So they can be virtual instruments or samplers, which actually produce sound, or they can be VST effects, so Virtual Studio Technology effects that we can use to process audio, to process sound. Even here in Ableton, as you can see, some of these plugins just have a VST written with the white little bar underneath, and some of them have a VST with a little sort of a keyboard kind of sketch underneath. That means that the ones that have a keyboard sketch underneath are actually VST instruments. These produce sound, these generate sound, like Native Instruments Massive or Reactor or let's say Serum. So any of these are actually producing sound. The ones that only have a white space underneath, those are just effects. And we can, let's say, load any of these by just drag and dropping them anywhere on any channel, including the master, sends, any channel. And just by dropping it right there, it will appear on the channel and of course open, since that is what I've chosen in preferences. And you have seen that in the former lesson. Now this plugin is going to process sound that goes through this channel. Easy as that. Plugins come in all sorts of functionalities. They can be any kind of a audio processor, spectral, dynamic, special effects. They can be producing sound. They can be synthesizers, samplers. They can even be special types of processing plugins like vocoders. Now, plugins exist as 64-bit versions and 32-bit versions for different architecture of our digital audio workstation. Now, don't get this confused. You could have a 64-bit Windows and run a 32-bit Ableton on it. 64-bit operating systems can run both 64-bit and 32-bit applications. Well, why do we have 64-bit and 32-bit plugins? Well, the architecture of the plugin used depends on the architecture of the software of the digital audio workstation that we are using. Right now, I have a 32-bit version of Ableton open, and that version of Ableton will be using 32-bit versions of plugins. If you can see right here, this plugin folder is named VST x86. That is the mark for the 32-bit architecture. Now, I could have named that folder any name. It's just how I like to call them. I like short names that describe well what's inside of them. I also have a VST x64 folder, which contains all of my 64-bit VSTs that I can use in other digital audio workstations, which are 64-bit based. So, to conclude, we have different architecture plugins, and most of the plugins you get and install, it will ask you, do you want 32-bit version, 64-bit version, or both? I install usually both. Some of the digital audio workstations I use are 32-bit, and some of them are 64-bit, and they require separate plugins for separate architectures. So you cannot use 32-bit plugins in a 64-bit Ableton or 64-bit plugins in a 32-bit Ableton or any other digital audio workstation. It just doesn't work like that. So the architecture of your digital audio workstation is determining what architecture plugins you use. It has nothing to do with the operating system's architecture. So once we installed those plugins into this folder, started Ableton, they were scanned, they show up in our list, and we can load them by just simply drag and dropping them onto any one of these channels, or even in the empty space where they would actually create a new channel. So if I drag this FM8 into empty space, it will create a new channel for me and load this FM8 synthesizer for me. The same thing goes for effects. If I wanted to process this FM8 synthesizer with an effect, I could just drag an effect right here. It would populate, open, it would be on the chain after my FM8. Now, of course, many of the plugins, like these VST instruments, they come in a standalone version. A standalone version would mean that you would not need a digital audio workstation to actually use them. Why? Because most of these synthesizers could be a standalone effect. What would you do with a distortion by itself? I mean, nothing. But if you had a sound generator like a synthesizer or a sampler, it would be a nice thing if it was in a standalone version. So you do have a standalone version which you can run without running your digital audio workstation and just use that synth and play it. This is sometimes good when you have a live performance and you just want to play one synthesizer. Then you actually do not require a digital audio workstation. You could just open up that plugin and its standalone version, which usually comes with all of the instruments, and just use it as a standalone application. Now, everything we talked about so far was regarding Windows. In Windows, you choose where you can install your VSTs. There could be a default path to a standard folder where VSTs go. I always tend to choose my own. On a Mac computer, you would just install your VST and it always goes to the system determined folder for VSTs or audio units. Audio units is a different standard for plugins that is used on Mac computers. And when installing plugins on a Mac, you can usually choose, do you want a VST version of the plugin, audio unit version of the plugin, which is just a different standard, but the plugin remains the same. And Ableton on Mac can use and utilize both VST and audio unit versions of the same plugin. Now, what is good about VST versions on a Mac is that when you create a project on a Mac computer and you use VST versions of the plugins, you can most probably reopen the same project on a PC because of the VST standard, and the plugins would be the same. If you used audio units on a Mac computer to create a project, you could not open that project on a PC. You could open it, but all of the plugins would be missing since audio unit plugins don't exist for a PC. So if you're looking for that kind of cross compatibility between a Mac and a PC, always tend to use VST plugins on a Mac so that you could open it on a PC and vice versa.